idea of Jesus telling stories, we have to remember that as we look through this parable and dig into this more and more, this is a very common way Jesus taught. But this is a very common way people taught in Jesus' day. Jesus always used these parables, used these stories to make a point. He wasn't just trying to tell a good story. He was making a point. And as we go through this more and more, what we'll see is the point he's making becomes more and more and more and more clear. And even to his audience. And that's what we're going to kind of do today. We're going to look at the background context of this parable. And then we're going to kind of look at the culture that we're dealing with as we delve into this. We're in Luke 15, sort of. We'll be there off and on today. Still no sound? I'll just be real loud.
He went to get somebody.
Not John. Luke 15. And what we're going to do is, as we look through this, that this is Jesus talking to a mixed group of people, but it seems to be directed primarily to a certain group of people. Luke 15, we looked at this last week. We'll look at this over and over. Chapter 15, verses 1 and 2 said, all the tax collectors and sinners were approaching to listen to him. And the Pharisees and the scribes were complaining. Notice there's two different groups of people. This group is complaining. Here's their complaint. This man welcomes sinners and eats with them. And that is really the genesis of what we're about to see in these three parables. So as we look at this, we need to, like I said, we need to lay some kind of cultural foundations here. Number one, and this is incredibly obvious, and understand what I'm saying here, is we have to remember the Bible is an ancient Middle Eastern book. Now, that is fairly obvious. I mean, we get that. But what we also have to understand is, as Jesus tells this story to those listeners, we can't try and figure this out from our perspective. We have to look at it from their perspective. I mean, there's meaning for us, and we'll talk about all that. But what we have to remember is this is every nuance of this, his listeners would understand. It shows it's on. I mean, I don't. Technical difficulties.
It's on here.
Is it amber the low battery though?
Yeah, should be green.
Is that always amber? Or is it
Yeah, it's almost always orange.
Is it?
Mm-hmm.
It's flashing.
No, it's working.
Does flashing mean anything?
Yeah, it's just working.
Uh-huh. So we just recorded me asking dumb questions. Great. Okay, so like I said, we have to keep in mind that this is the culture this is too. Now, and the reason I say that is what we understand even today is we just don't get the Middle East. I mean, we don't understand their culture very well. If you've ever talked to Mike Kish, Mike spent a lot of time in Iraq, I believe, and Mike got to know a lot of people there, and he said, that getting to know their culture helps you to understand them. And he was there a while, and he said, even in the people that he got to know kind of well, there's still some cultural nuances that you just don't get. I mean, and that's us. We just don't understand. We still, to this day, we don't understand the Middle Eastern culture very well. And that's not, that is what it is. So when we look at how, with Jesus dealing with, in his day, we have to understand that the culture he's in is different than ours anyway, but then it's also 2,000 years ago. So we have to remember some of the nuance of that. Turn over to Mark chapter 12. one of the things we also can't do, and I talked about this some last week, is that there were a lot of, in the Middle Ages in particular, there were several theologians, religious people who really tried to allegorize everything about the parables and tried to make them say things that just because of what they're, what Jesus was saying, they tried to make it into something a little bit more fascinating or whatever. Somebody read, if you would, Mark chapter 12, verse 37. The other thing we have to be careful about, we can't try and make these parables too, I don't know the word, maybe contemporary, too intellectual. I mean, Jesus is telling stories. Somebody read verse 37 for me, please. Mark 12:37.
David himself calls him Lord. So how is he his son? And the great throng heard him gladly.
Okay, the main point of that is the last phrase. The throng, the group of people heard him how?
Gladly.
What do other translations say? With delight. The regular guy understood Jesus, and they were thrilled to listen to him, which tells us that Jesus isn't trying to be super philosophical, or he's not trying to make these really deep and he's just telling stories. And the average guy was like, I get this. I get what he's saying. Now, we talked last week about Jesus himself quoted Isaiah 6, that prophecy, and said, the people who want to hear, we're going to hear, and they're going to enjoy it. The people who just don't want to listen are going to be confused anyway. So we have to remember that Jesus is telling things that people are going to understand. We also have to remember, too, that even the most educated, even the higher society people of Jesus' day still would have been pretty familiar with agrarian life. When I was in college at Oklahoma State, I worked at this farm supply store. I knew nothing about any of this stuff. I don't know how I got the job, honestly. Well, I do, because my dad worked at a big place that bought a bunch of stuff from the store, and they saw my last name and thought it'd be good for him, I guess. But so the third, fourth day I was at work, had a guy come in with just this mess of belt stuff, and he said, I need to fix the belt of my round baler. And I was like, okay. And it was like, I had no idea what he was talking. I knew I'd seen a round baler before, I think. But it was like, I didn't know what he was talking about. And at first he was a little bit bothered, because I was the only one there besides the owner, and she wasn't going to do it. She had to do other stuff. So I told him, I was like, I don't get this. He was, you work at a farm supply store in Stillwater, Oklahoma. And I said, oh yeah, I get it. But so very nice of him. He kind of coached me through it. And he was like, this is something you're going to end up doing a lot. And I did. I repaired belts for balers a dozen times. And I was a kid from suburbia. I grew up in Broken Arrow, which was right outside Tulsa. But and then as I got to talk with this guy, he was a professor at Oklahoma State. And he was like an economics professor or something. But his thing, he was telling me, he goes, people are going to expect you to know how to do this because of where I am. Well, for us, to me, that was kind of a slap in the face. It's like, wow, I better figure this out. Go back to Jesus' day, Jesus talking about planting fields and throwing seeds and all this stuff. Even the upper crust would have an understanding, because it happened around them all the time. Maybe they weren't involved with it. And as you get into Jerusalem and the people who were, Jerusalem, the larger cities, there were probably people who that was kind of distant from them. But for the most part, they understood this way of life. We also would understand, we need to understand that village life was also very much a part of that culture. So there's a lot of stuff in this parable that isn't explained. There's a lot of things that are just kind of nuances that we can read right through it and just go, well, I don't see what the big deal is there. But when we think about, like, for instance, let me just jump ahead. When the son comes back, in a village in that day, the whole village would have been involved in, do we welcome this guy back or not? The listeners to Jesus, as Jesus begins to tell this story, the fact that the way he mentions the two sons and the dad, the listeners would have went, oh, this guy's kind of a big deal in this town. And we don't see that because we're not as familiar as they were. But the Bible does that all the time. When the Bible talks about the wedding feast at Cana, what do we think of when we think of a wedding?
Reception and
Yeah.
people sitting around and talking.
Yeah, we think of the groom's family on this side, the bride's family, whatever, however that works. And we think very structured. A wedding feast in Jesus' day was a days-long thing, and people came and stayed, and it was you think of Mary, Joseph and Mary. What's the word that describes Joseph and Mary before they betrothed? They were betrothed. We don't think that way, which meant to them they were committed to each other way before they were even married. And it was like a year-long thing of their betrothal. And the Bible doesn't go into detail about that. You have to just go figure that out. Well, and that's kind of what it is with some of these things about the family that we see in this parable. And that's another thing. Family in Jesus, and not that family isn't important today, but family and extended family was huge. Especially in a village, especially in an agrarian culture. Why would that be?
They depended on each other.
They depended on each other.
And they knew each other. There were no secrets.
Yeah. And how did they live, usually? I mean, as far as their... in one house.
There was no social security, so if you wanted to retire, you had to have someone younger to come along and buy the food and take care of the house and take over things, because if you didn't have a son or typically sons, you were out on the streets and begging, because once you got to a certain point and couldn't earn a living, there was no security or safety net.
Yeah, exactly. Your safety net was your children and grandchildren. And families generationally would live in the same house. In a lot of villages, there'd be, I guess you'd think of it as the first house that was built, and then they just build little rooms on. That's just kind of a side note. When Jesus says, "In my Father's house are many dwelling places," that's the image those people would have had. Is that there's a big house, then there's the little dwelling places added onto it as the family grows. So that's Jesus saying, "There's a home, there's a place for you in my home." So. In this village life, this agrarian life, the family is also the workforce. So when younger brother says, you know what, I'm out of here. We're losing somebody who knows the farm. We're losing somebody who knows how things work on our farm and our family. We're losing a worker, and he's just saying, I'm going to go do something I want to do. So there's nuances that as we dig into this further that really make a difference as to how this all plays out. So the background as far as the culture with this, or the context with this, we need to also see as we look at this parable where we were in Jesus' ministry, because this is a huge factor in this whole parable. Look over to Luke chapter 9. If you're at Luke 15, you can go back to chapter 10, and you can start to see more and more parables. This is how Jesus, like I said, this is how Jesus taught, especially later in his ministry. Or I guess at this part of his ministry anyway. We talked last week, Matthew 13 is a big section of parables in that area of Matthew. But in Luke chapter 9, look back to Luke 9, what's the verse? 51. When the days were coming to a close for him to be taken up, he determined to journey to Jerusalem. Does anybody else's translation use something else besides determined?
He set his face.
He set his face. I love that expression, because that's the context of this parable. He knows he's moving. Why is he going to Jerusalem?
Crucifixion.
Yeah, he's going to die. And he knows it. He knows he goes into Jerusalem and he comes out a little bit every night. But this tells us he knows this is the beginning of the end. So as he begins to make this move toward Jerusalem, this is really the theme of the second half of Luke. That this is Jesus moving toward Jerusalem, moving toward what he knows to be the end of his life. And he is, everything he says, everything he teaches throughout, from this point forward, we have to keep it in the context of understanding. He knows he's going to die. He knows he's in the last weeks, probably months of his life. At this point where we are in Luke 15, Jesus has already been in his ministry for probably 2.5 years already. So Luke's very chronological, and with Luke's a pretty good sized book, but at Luke 15, we're nearing the end of Jesus' life already. I mean, we're getting close anyway. Look back. Well, at the beginning of chapter 9, this is where Peter makes his great confession. Then Jesus says this. Then Jesus sets his face to the cross. And the whole drama, or the whole, I guess drama, the impact of all this builds through the end of chapter 19. What's the end of chapter 19? Like 1920-ish and following.
Triumphal entry.
Triumphal entry. This is literally from that verse, from 9:51 or whatever it was, through the end of chapter 19. Keep it in that context. This is Jesus going to Jerusalem to the point where he's going to come into Jerusalem and it all ends. So, keeping that in mind, I think, helps us to understand Jesus isn't hiding who he is anymore at this point. Jesus isn't telling people, don't tell people that I did this. This is Jesus going, okay, here we come. This is the last little bit of his whole ministry. So the drama builds from chapter 9 through 19:28. And everything he does from this point forward, the second half of Luke, all of it points toward the cross. And that's super important too in the context of these parables. And I keep saying these three parables because they're all three in chapter 15. We're just going to focus on Prodigal, but you can't ignore the other two either. And in all of this, and we talked about this some last week, but I want to kind of dive into this a little bit more. The main audience that's standing around here, that really I believe this parable is really directed to, is the Jewish leaders. Now, it says scribes and Pharisees. So let's stop for a minute. And I think we all, I mean, you've all probably heard explanations of who these people are or whatever. Give me an example. Who's one of the most well-known Pharisees in the Old Testament? In the Old Testament. There weren't any. You threw me off when you said, I was like, Tommy's really smart. You threw me off. That just blew my whole answer. There weren't any. There were no Pharisees in the Old Testament. So when we think, but there were scribes. Who's a scribe in the Old Testament? Isaiah, kind of. Ezra is called a scribe. I mean, Ezra was a guy, the scribes in the Old Testament were the writers of the law. They were copyists, basically. In the intertestamental period, if you were in Charles's class last quarter, you talked about this, I'm sure. The Jewish system went from a focus on the practices of Judaism, the temple, the sacrifices, and all that, to a keeping of the law. What changed?
Lost the temple.
They lost the temple. So there's no place for them to go. They were in exile for a long time. Their things are so different that they begin to gradually focus more on keeping the law, which is good. I mean, that's not terrible. Yeah, this article I found in the Jewish university. I don't remember what the university was, but this guy wrote a gigantic paper about the whole history of all these people. But he said the Pharisees were absolutely the best people there were, and they were absolutely the worst people there were, because they were so focused on keeping the law. But then they got so focused on keeping the law, they forgot about people, and they began to make their own laws. Because there was no temple, we can kind of understand that mindset shift. That since we can't go do our sacrifices, we can't honor God in that way. We know the law. We know. When they come back out of captivity, Ezra and Nehemiah, they lead them back and they read the law to them. The people stand, and it's a big, amazing scene. But the people then decide, okay, we're going to keep the... And throughout that 400 years between the Testaments, that's when the Pharisees develop the... let's see. The scribes. And I'm just going to read from the... I hate to do it. I'm just going to read this because this guy says it a lot better than I do. The scribes were the lawyers whose primary job was to copy the scriptures, but their focus became the details or the letters of the law, and then they transitioned from mere copyists to the teachers and translators of the scripture. And that's something we can understand how that would happen, right? I'm the one copying the law. I'm the one writing it out all the time, so I know this better than anybody else. So they became the ones who said, here's what the law means. Here's what this text means. The Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was this group of 70 leaders that... some say this guy's theory is that it began under the rule of King Jehoshaphat, when he appointed a group of people to oversee some things, and that may have been the origins of these people, of this group of people. Now the Pharisees comes from a word that just means separate, that they were considered separatists, and some people think that word separatists, the word that they used to call themselves, was kind of their idea at first, that they kind of separated themselves. They were going to be they were going to be really, really focused on the law. But by the time Jesus' day, and really even after Jesus' day, the Pharisees the word separatist became kind of a negative, because they had become so separate that they just weren't like normal people anymore. The Pharisees, likely that this group evolved out of a priestly group of Jewish separatists during the Maccabean revolt. The revolt began when certain Jewish priests refused to bow down to Antiochus Epiphanes, who sought to protect the right worship of God. Jesus eventually criticized the Pharisees for their inflexible adherence to traditions of their fathers rather than seeking God. And then there's the Sadducees. Now, what's interesting in Jesus's dealings, it's much more often it's the scribes and the Pharisees. The Sadducees kind of stay out, it seems like. We kind of see them here and there, but that's kind of an interesting study on its own, is how those groups of people relate with Jesus, because it's usually the scribes and the Pharisees. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees, what do you know about the Sadducees? What's one of their main characteristics?
They don't believe in resurrection.
Yep, they don't believe in the resurrection, so they're sad, you see. I don't know where I learned that as a child, but
they also just adhere to the Pentateuch.
yeah, the Torah is the first 5 books are all they cared about. The law, the histories, they didn't care about those. And the Pharisees and Sadducees hated each other. I mean, they did not get along. In fact, you see in John 12, I think, that the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Herodians get together, and it's like the enemy of my, whatever it is. I don't like this guy, so I don't like you instead, because we both hate that guy. I mean, that's how it worked. These groups of people who don't get along at all hated Jesus enough to work together. Which is, I mean, that is, again, for us, it's just kind of, wow, that's interesting. But if you were to have been in Jesus' day, and you would have seen Pharisees, Sadducees, and Herodians conspiring together, it would be like, I don't know, I mean, it'd be like Yankees and the Red Sox getting together and hanging out at a picnic or something. It's just, it doesn't happen.
Oh, the Republicans and Democrats.
Yeah, well, yeah, Republicans and Democrats, you could go that route even. But, so these are the people that are, the scribes and Pharisees. The Pharisees had this, and Jesus tells them over and over that you guys have put laws on the people that they just can't keep, and you know they can't keep. You have made this relationship with God a burden that it shouldn't be. But these people just hated Jesus. So as we look at this parable, we have to remember that these are the people who were the architects, if you will, of modern Judaism. In other words, Judaism as it was supposed to be had its own, God-given origin. These guys were the ones who had kind of made it into what we see it in the New Testament, where it's all these, Jesus talks about, and even James writes about this, people who want to come in and they want the best seats. The Pharisees, the scribes and Pharisees, that was them. When they came into the synagogue, you gave them the best seats. You gave them particular honor. You gave them deference in everything. And that was never how it was supposed. God told people to love everybody. Treat everybody the same way. Be respectful to those who are ruling authorities or whatever. But it was never grovel. And that's what it became in Jesus' day. The Pharisees, this ruling elite, had become elitists, to where the average guy couldn't be around them, didn't even look at them in a lot of cases. So when Jesus starts to deal with these guys more directly in this second half of his ministry, he begins to point out very, very bluntly the things that they're doing. Early in his ministry, he kind of avoids them. He doesn't really, there's no direct confrontation. Late in his ministry, we'll look at one in just a minute, it becomes very, very direct. It becomes very, very personal. The other thing about these guys, and this is just bizarre, they were super legalistic, but they were also very hypocritical, because the laws that they said were super important, they were super legalistic about. But every Jew knew that God said love your neighbor. Every Jew knew that loving each other was part of the deal. But these guys wouldn't. They looked down on people below them in cultural and in societal standards. So they're very, very hypocritical in that regard. I skipped over this. Turn over to Romans chapter 10 real quick, because this is one of those things that when we think about who Paul was, and you really get to understand who the Pharisees were, you get to understand who this group of people is, it really puts Paul in a different perspective. Romans chapter 10, verse 1 says, "Brothers and sisters, my heart's desire and prayer to God concerning them," and that is talking about Israel as a nation, "concerning them is for their salvation. I can testify about them, that they have zeal for God, but not according to knowledge, since they are ignorant of the righteousness of God, and have attempted to establish their own righteousness. They have not submitted to God's righteousness." So this is Paul saying, I know who these people are, because he was one of them. These are people who have this incredible desire for God, but it's not according to the knowledge that God provided. It's what they want. It's the way that they see it. So, like I said, when you think of Paul, and it would be a kind of a side note, when you think of Paul, think that he comes from this background. He comes from this Pharisaic, legalistic, elitist background. And he becomes the Paul that we know. That's fascinating to me. But look over to Matthew 23, because this to me is one of those scenes that really kind of sums up where we are with Jesus. This is a little bit ahead of where we are in Luke 15, but not terribly much. As Jesus, like I said, as Jesus gets to this point in his ministry, he is done with dodging the Pharisees. John chapter 8, he has a very direct confrontation with the scribes and Pharisees. In Matthew 23, this is, if you've ever seen, there's a DVD series that's called Visualize Bible. That is, I think they have Matthew and Acts. I'm not sure what else they have. But the guy that plays Jesus, to me, is one of the best portrayals of Jesus there is. It's kind of similar to the chosen Jesus. He's very lighthearted. can be very serious. In Matthew 23, he gets very serious. But I mean, it's just it's a very unique portrayal of Jesus. So if you ever want to look that up, that's really cool to watch. But in this scene, the guy that plays Jesus, to me, it's fascinating. Because he's standing in this group of people, he's standing in the temple courtyard, and he has, as kind of in that previous scene, there's the regular people are kind of standing around doing their thing, and of course the scribes and Pharisees are off away from the people doing their thing. And Jesus is talking to the crowd, the way they portray it. He's talking to the crowd, and he's talking about the scribes and Pharisees. And then he walks over to them, and chapter 23, verse 23. And this is the third time he said this. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You pay a tenth of mint, dill, and cumin, and yet you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. These things should have been done without neglecting the others. And skip down to verse 27. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You're like whitewashed tombs, which appear beautiful on the outside, but inside are full of the bones of the dead and every kind of impurity. Now again, that's a huge statement Jesus makes, because that's stuff that Jewish people aren't supposed to be around, dead stuff. And he says that's what's inside you. And I'm not going to have time to get into this a great deal. But this is where Jesus is now. He's to the point where it is time to directly confront these people. It's time to deal with what these people have done to the average Jew. The Sanhedrin, this group of religious leaders, they had brokered kind of a truce with the Romans, to where you let us do what we do, and we'll make sure we pay taxes to you. We'll make sure that everything you expect us to do is done, and we'll keep the people down. So that's why when Jesus comes in to Jerusalem, in John 12, we see this group of leaders saying, if we don't stop this guy, we're going to lose both our position and our nation. Because what they're saying is, as Jesus is becoming more and more popular, we're going to mess this up with the Romans, we're going to mess it up for ourselves, this is all going to fall apart because of this guy. So that, just so you understand, this is who Jesus is talking to. And that's the thing, as Jesus is telling this parable in Luke 15, he knows that these are the people who are watching him tell them. And this isn't just a doctrinal difference. This isn't Jesus teaches something, a little nuance of something different than they believe, and they're like, well, we need to address it. They hate this guy because he's embarrassed them. He has called them out for exactly what they are, and the crowds are listening. The crowds are following Jesus, and they understand who he is. He's at the, we're not going to look at those verses. Matthew 12, 24, Luke 11, 15, that's where you can see that now Jesus even knows there's no going back from this. We're in this, and the Pharisees, these Jewish leaders, will not quit until I'm dead. Their main complaint with Jesus, we see it in Luke 14, 14 and 15 both, that he is welcoming these people that the Pharisees, scribes, religious leaders shunned completely. He is welcoming sinners, that he is a friend, is what they call it. And he was. I mean, we get that. And when they say he's a friend of sinners, they're saying that derogatorily. For us, when we say that, we say, thank goodness that he's a friend of sinners. Because this is who Jesus was. What they don't get is that Jesus is there to redeem these people. He's there to heal these people. And we talked about this some last week, the fact that he even ate with them. To them, that was a huge deal. The fact that he would go to a meal and sit at a table with these people. To the Jewish elite, that was reprehensible. That to them proved that he was satanic. They even say he's a son of Beelzebub. And it's, that he's a drunk and a wine bibber and a glutton, is what the old King James said. And it's because he shared a table with these people. So he's got to be one of them. He's got to be just like they are. What they don't get is that Jesus' point was to heal these people. That was the reason he was there. What Jesus does is, the main thing that he does is he exposes he exposes the hypocrisy of the leadership. And the leadership, these Jewish leaders are at the point where they realize that the intolerance of Jesus has gone from, we don't really like this guy, to we have to get rid of this guy. It's been ratcheted up over and over to the point that they understand and Jesus understands he's got to die. And that's the crowd. As Jesus is in this moment in Luke 15, when he starts to tell these three parables about a lost sheep that the shepherd goes after, and a lost coin that the woman goes after, and then this lost son that is welcomed back home. As Jesus says all these things, what I want you to remember this whole quarter is who's listening. Because the group that's listening are the people who understand, especially when we get to the older brother, the crowd is, I told you last week, there's going to be several moments where you can just imagine the crowd go, and there will be several of those, because the crowd's going to realize he's talking about them. He's talking about these people who are so willing to reject what God accepts. And that is really the challenge with all of this. Their resentment for Jesus it's beyond normal. It's now to the point where they're willing to put aside everything they know that's right or wrong. They're ready to kill Jesus. So we'll jump into actually looking at this parable starting next week. Any thoughts? Like I say, I hope this isn't too tedious, but I think you need to understand what is happening as he starts to tell this parable, because it magnifies what's going on. It magnifies this parable itself to really see what's happening in the moment. Okay, we'll see you in like 5 minutes.